Hello, and welcome to day 10 of the 30-day Speaking to Camera Challenge, where I attempt to speak to the camera every day for 30 days. So far, we are a third of the way in. I've seen fantastic results so far, but at the same time, obviously, still quite a way to go. I'm looking forward to seeing how things look at the end of day 30. So, during each of these days, I've looked at various different topics, whether it be some self-reflection, whether it be looking at some of my hobbies, whether it be dealing with something slightly darker like death. Each of these have been fantastic learning experiences. However, I think I'm going to branch out a little bit today and focus on something a little bit more abstract, I suppose in the same way as death. So today I'm going to be looking at ideologies. Why are they so important? Where do mine align? And why in modern society do they often tend to be so polarizing? I feel like if I look back in time, we've always been a civilization or people that tend to align very strongly with the nation. We have a sense of wanting to belong. And quite often, unfortunately, we tend to align with the extremes. I think in English, that's something that back in the day, we constantly looked at the nature of othering, or creating someone as the other, through which your ideology was based or could identify. So you would look at something like communism and you would say you were a capitalist and everything was vehemently opposed. Today, too much the same. We can look at your liberals versus conservatives. We can look at your capitalists versus your socialists. We can look at your conservatives versus your liberals and the interplay in American politics that seems to create. Obviously, every nation seems to have that. Somehow politics seems to drag out the worst of that. And instead of just, I suppose, being willing to listen, quite often we seem to gravitate towards extremes, and it's stating why you're right, why the opponent's wrong, instead of looking at it logically and saying, that point has merit. And I think if I'm looking at general dialogues, this tends to be quite true. Somehow, in a polarized society, this has been largely undone. But again, looking back at history, at what point were we open to those discussions? I mean, I'm not going to go and say that we're any better today or any worse. I do think we're a little bit worse. If I look at dialogues, I think if I look at the extremists today, they're far less likely to listen than they probably ever were. Not sure why this is, but it's almost the fact that you have an opposing ideology means that nothing that you say or do can be of value. When we're looking at cancel culture and the very fact that it exists doesn't necessarily make sense. While I can look at the ideology of another, I should be able to say, I don't agree with that, but you can say other things in other fields that make perfect sense. You might even say something within that political realm that does make sense. And I can say that holds value, but it's not merely the fact that you belong to one ideological group that I should discount everything you say. And I think in society today, that's almost the greatest problem. And I think that's my big issue with the woke movement, is the fact that all they've done is say there is no such thing as dialogue. Everything I say is truth, and nothing else matters. There is no scope for dialogue. Half the time, truth doesn't even really seem to matter. It's just an opinion dressed as truth. Yet somehow the facts are inconsequential. I suppose my big question that I've been having recently is, how did we get to a state where that exists? How did we get to a place where everything has to be so polarized, where we cannot possibly accept that someone has a differing opinion and allowing for that to be okay? If I look at my life, quite often with those people with vastly differing opinions lead to the greatest growth in my life. For they challenge the very ideals. They challenge the preconceived ideals, rather. They force me to question. What is. Why have I thought the way I have? Why have I operated under the assumption that certain things are truth without ever really going and questioning them? And it's through that growth that the greatest self-discoveries are made. Looking at myself again, I used to be a very staunch liberal back at university. And gradually over time, and I think this is partly due to the lack of dialogue, my political orientation shifted. And shifted quite drastically, actually. And I suppose sometimes that's something to do with age. It's something to do with more lived experience. It's being out in the world and I suppose being more of a realist as opposed to an idealist. And I think when we're young, we do have that need or desire to be idealistic, to look at things as we would like them to be, but not necessarily looking at how they can be or how naturally this could fit in with the world based on the real world as it exists. Because utopia and idealism are fantastic as concepts. But at the same time, if we're ever going to make something along those lines happen, you have to be able to place them over the existing structure. You have to be able to place them within the real world and say they will operate effectively. Not just assume that everything will suddenly change overnight. People will still exist. Places will still exist. The structures will still exist. You would basically have to overturn and change millennia of past behavior. And I think generally that's been my issue with the woke movement, is everything is just taken as this is truth, this is what should be. Instead of looking at things logically and saying, what does this mean for the greater scope of things? Let's have a discussion about it. I don't know how I got so into the woke discussion, starting with ideologies. But anyway, it is what it is. Regardless, I've got a bit of a busy morning ahead, so I'm going to have to call it there early. If you did manage to make it this far, thanks again for watching. I always appreciate it. And I hope you have an absolutely spectacular one. Cheers.